Okay. Why do you believe segregation exists in public schools today?
I guess it depends on what we're talking about. In the South, uh, long-standing patterns of residential discrimination. School zones are divvied out, or up rather, um, by residential patterns. And if you have a long-standing history of segregation in a place, residential segregation, right? The way that busing didn't work, right? So people generally aren't bused anymore to different sections, despite the fact that there are a lot of places that have open enrollment. People generally go to neighborhood schools. If your neighborhoods are segregated, then the schools happen to be segregated. Another answer, and this isn't just applicable to the South, has to do with class. Many people associate impoverished neighborhoods, impoverished communities with poor school systems, so people are disincentivized in many instances to put their kids in schools with the majority of people on free and reduced lunch, in large part because those schools don't perform well. But that also feeds into what I said earlier about residential segregation. Ultimately, however, though, I think some of this just boils down to good old American racism. I think particularly the historical legacy of American racism. Residential patterns in places like Richmond are directly linked to the city's longstanding antipathy over the issue of race. And if the laws are set up historically to disallow certain people to move into particular neighborhoods, and over time, those neighborhoods become racially homogenous. If neighborhoods become racially homogenous, then the schools become racially homogenous. And in places like the South, where people resisted decisions like Brown versus Board by coming up with all kinds of crafty ways of getting around public school integration, the schools were probably more integrated in the late 1960s, early 1970s than they are now, in large part because the Supreme Court came in the late 20th century and relatively overturned some of the mandates about cross-city busing. So, but I also think on some level, people are generally still scared, not so much in elementary school, but in junior high and high school, about the implications of racial integration, in large part because young children, adolescents, do what adolescents do. And I think a lot of people on some level are fearful of the implications that class might have with integration, but more importantly, that underperforming schools and schools that have a majority of people on free and reduced lunch are going to somehow impinge upon their child's ability to get a decent education. And let's be even more frank, I think, on some level, no one wants to leverage their child's future on the promise of integration. So people are reluctant in many instances to integrate public schools, but because of all of the structural forces that I delineated at the beginning of this video, a lot of times we like to reduce these things to individual action or individual acts of bigotry, but really there are structural forces that reinforce the nature of how segregated schools are, that reinforce residential patterns of neighborhood segregation. And if neighborhoods are segregated, I'm going to keep saying this, then generally schools are segregated, in large part because we've done a piss-poor job of guaranteeing cross-city busing and things of that nature. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.